Hi everyone, it's Arthur here. Just before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that we're talking to the Schools Consent Project. We're going to be discussing a range of issues to do with consent, including the legal definition. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Welcome to TandTeaching, the educational podcast you can listen to with a cup of tea. I'm Arthur Moore, and with me today, it's not Mike Harrowell. It's someone who some would say I spend even more time with. It's my partner making her full debut on TandTeaching. It's Amy Cutmore. Hi, Amy.
Hi. Yeah, amazing. You spend more time with someone other than Mike. I don't think the listeners are going to believe that.
I know.
It's a special bromance.
It's a special bond, special bond. Before we jump into today's pod, do you want to give us the quick "Who is Amy Cutmore" story?
Yeah, okay. So I am a secondary English teacher. I think this is actually I think I've hit my decade of teaching this year. So yeah, big moment. I mean, similar to you, obviously, I've followed you around the world, teaching with you internationally, and across the UK, various like kind of key stage coordinator stuff within the English department, and yeah.
And do you want to hear who we've got on today's pod?
I would love to. I'm really excited about this.
Well, you should be, because we've got Monica Bogle from the School Consent Project. The School Consent Project is an organisation that sends lawyers into schools to teach students the legal definition of consent, and they aim to normalise conversation about consent. This is an absolutely brilliant pod about something that is so important to be discussed in schools with our young people. You're going to get so much out of this. So go away, put on the kettle, get a cup of tea, get a couple of biscuits, and sit back, and we'll be back with Monica from the School Consent Project. Welcome back to TandTeaching. We are joined by Monica from the School Consent Project. Monica, welcome to TandTeaching.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, it's our absolute pleasure to have you on. Do you want to give us a quick idea of kind of your background, and then give us the quick insight into what the School Consent Project is all about?
Sure, absolutely. So I am the director of the Schools Consent Project. My background is as a lawyer. I'm a former solicitor, used to practice as a media lawyer, what feels like many moons ago now. And now I help run the Schools Consent Project, which is a charity sending lawyers, legally trained workshop facilitators into secondary school spaces to teach young people about consent, their rights and responsibilities in that area in the context of the law. And we cover all sorts of things in those workshops, the basics around consent and what it means in legal terms and non-legal terms, as well as covering certain sexual offences as well.
And I think what's really nice is coming it from that legal background. That's what the School Consent Project is all about. Is all about, if I'm correct there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty much our USP. We approach it from the legal angle, although the law is a fundamental underpinning of what we talk about. But ultimately, we're just trying to open up these conversations amongst young people. We know how needed they are. And if it's helpful, I can tell you why the Schools Consent Project was set up, because actually that plays into that legal angle as well.
No, please do. Please do.
Yeah, it was founded back in 2015 by a criminal barrister, Kate Parker, who has just jumped to running the SCP full time with me as well, which is wonderful. And she set it up because a couple of reasons. The first one being that, as is unfortunately the experience of so many people, young or otherwise, particularly women, a lot of the women in her life were experiencing forms of sexually harmful behaviors, whether it was the, grope on the night bus, the catcalling type stuff, right through to really serious sexual violence as well. And coupled with that, as a new barrister, she was finding a lot of cases landing on her desk involving young people, often falling foul of the law, and often because they just didn't understand what the laws were, and they were overstepping those laws without knowing the full gravity of the consequences of it. That tended to be in the online space as well, sharing nudes, all of those kinds of issues. And out of that was born this desire that if we could educate young people, teach them what their rights are, their responsibilities are, understand the laws, it would be a preventative tool, a way to challenge those behaviours before they even take place.
And I think this is something every teacher kind of listens to us, or anyone who's working in school will be like, unfortunately, we've all had experience of talking with our young people about this. I know, Amy, you're working in an all girls school, and this is something that comes up of, like, as you said, like being on the bus or going in to get like a coffee or something beforehand.
Yeah, we've actually been, I was with a year 10 group actually last week, and we, in their PSHE lesson was actually about consent. I was wondering, you'd mentioned like social media and stuff in what you were just saying. Do you find that that forms like a much bigger part of what you do in schools now than maybe it did when the school's consent project started?
Possibly, yes. I mean, I think that the current generation of students, secondary school students, they are growing up in a world where their online and offline experiences are almost seamless. They morph from one into the other in a way that it was never the case, certainly for me growing up, or even the new lawyers coming through now. And it comes up time and again, and it is definitely that space where sometimes those boundaries get blurred, or they get treated in a different way because they're in an online space, and we somehow think that they are different when in reality they're not.
And with that kind of blurring, as you said, like getting more involved in our students' kind of life, and then bringing that experience into school, I was wondering, as teachers and kind of educators, like, this is the kind of thing we should be covering in school. Like, we know this is on PSHE. We know we teach lessons on this, as Amy said. So, like, from your experience and kind of your perspective, why is that need for something like the school consent project to even exist? And like, when you talk to schools, what are they asking for you to come in and do with them?
Yeah, there's probably a couple of points there. The first one is broad point. When we think about the state of sexual violence in the world, in this country, and that's where we're talking about, and the statistics, they're just galling when you stop and think about them. 1 in 3 women globally will be a victim of sexual assault or sexual violence in their lifetime. In the UK, I think it's 1 in 4 women, so we're talking adult women, will be sexually assaulted as an adult. It's 1 in 6 children will be sexually abused as a child. And it's 1 in 18 men who might be sexually assaulted as adults as well. And when you play that into the criminal justice system, that system actually is failing everyone, victims, perpetrators. The system is not really working. And oftentimes we're finding that when things get reported, which is rare in and of itself, the way the criminal justice system deals with it is that I think the statistics are something like 91% of rapes never even get to the point where they're charged. And anything that even makes it to that point, only 2% of those recorded rapes result in a conviction. So you just see this narrowing of the system as you go through. So the care for education, it's part of our motto. We believe education is prevention, and by early education we can change a lot of the attitudes that feed into that cycle as well. So there's a real need for it already. The second point to that is consent education, in fact, and the law around consent education is now pretty much mandated by the regulations, and so teachers are required to teach it. We put so much on our teachers these days. I sometimes feel, I'm a parent of 2 teenagers as well, and I sometimes think, particularly as parents, we almost hand our children over and say, can you please raise our children? And we want them to do all the academics, but we also want them to learn how to be financially literate, and we want them to navigate relationships in a healthy, safe way. And there is so much pressure on teachers to cover all of those things, and definitely not enough time, and all of those pressures come together. And so that need, that demand, even if we say, yes, we must teach our children, it's got to be met in a way which is coherent, accurate. We want to make sure that our kids are getting that information in a really accurate way, and in a way that's done that addresses the issues that they're facing at the point at which they're facing them.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there about like you obviously as the school's consent project coming in as the experts into
Yeah.
that conversation with our young people. Because I mean, like, okay, I'm a trained and qualified teacher, but I'm qualified to teach English literature. So PSHE is and for so many teachers, it's part of our role as form tutors. And that's how we deliver it with that kind of relationship, that pastoral side with our form groups. But I'm not an expert in like so much of that content. So having people like the Schools Consent Project come in to have these discussions, you know so much more, you can answer so many more of their questions, and therefore it makes it a much more useful session potentially than what I could deliver.
Yeah, and we never say well, we're not putting ourselves forward as the only way to teach consent education. In fact, this problem isn't just a problem for young people or in schools and in school spaces. It's everywhere, and it's something that we should all be addressing. And I often will say, consent and consent education and the concept of consent underpins all of our relationships. It's not just the sexual ones. It's how we relate to each other in a professional environment or our family relationships and our friendships. And so it starts well before that, those sexual interactions which we might be having as well. And so it's got to be a group effort. There's very much a place, and of course, schools are an establishment which is designed for educating, and so that's a really good formal place to provide this kind of education. But unless we're taught something ourselves, how are we going to pass on that knowledge as well? And so I think we fill a really nice gap in that sense. We bring the legal angle to it, but we can support what schools may already be doing, and we can help kickstart the conversation as well. Often schools will have us in and we'll run our workshop, and it means that they can continue that conversation in the next lesson and the following year and so on. Yeah.
I think there's also like from a teacher perspective, like yes, like there's a lot going on. Yes, like PSHE sometimes maybe isn't the top of someone's to-do list, unfortunately, but like also these conversations are awkward to have with your students. Like I think we should acknowledge that. Like I like it's a very hard topic, especially if you haven't got the training and
Or even
kind
just like the language sometimes, like knowing what words to use.
yeah, like it's awkward to stand in front of a group of
15-year-olds,
15-year-olds and be like, right, today we're going to talk about consent. And I think that's where like sometimes having an outsider, someone who they don't have that, oh well, we've had this really awkward conversation. Now I've got to go into maths and do trigonometry with Mr. Moore. Like that's a weird kind of dynamic change straight there. So I was wondering, like you do these workshops, don't you, with secondary age students? Like how do you and your team
Yeah.
like do you feel awkward or do you not feel awkward because you've got so much training, or is it the legal perspective? Like how do you get over that like initial like this is going to be an awkward hour, guys?
Yeah, and I guess these are some of the teaching tips we give when we're speaking to teachers as well, really, because I totally get your point. And I often say teachers are humans. I mean, I feel like I should have a t-shirt made up with that printed on. We're all individuals, and we come to things with our own experiences which form how we do what we do, isn't it? And whatever our past experience might be. Sex education for me growing up was, I mean, it was so long ago for a start, but it was in the hall, and there were VHS tapes back then. So a teacher would put this VHS tape into a video recorder, press play, the lights went down, we watched something very awkward happening on a screen, and then that was it. That was the element of sex education covered, tick and done. And so now when I'm talking to children in our workshops, but my own children even, having that conversation means I've got to educate myself in order to have that conversation. You're absolutely right. Teachers really, the relationship they have with their students is, there are pros to it and cons to it, right? You might have a really good relationship with a set of students, so that conversation might not be difficult for you. You might be comfortable in that conversation yourself, so it's not difficult. But as you've just said, that's not true of everyone. And so we kind of take that away. Our approach because our approach is a legal one in many respects, it actually helps a great deal in removing some of the personal out of it too. The law is a great leveler. It applies to everyone, right? We're all citizens of this country, so we are subject to the same laws. our rights under the law are the same, regardless of our socioeconomic background, regardless of our sexuality or our gender. And so the language of the law lends itself really well to having that conversation in quite a factual, objective way without needing to moralize. Of course, we're teaching making ethical decisions and good decisions for yourself, but ultimately we're arming the young people with the knowledge, the confidence to be able to articulate what they want, what they don't want, to read those signals in others. And that is the approach we tend to take. Our workshops are interactive, so we also use lots of tools, like we play games, and we'll make a point by playing a game, and then we'll make the heavier point around it. But the game itself is usually designed around something completely out of the sexual context and an everyday example. One of the games we play, for example, is just identifying, sort of our levels of comfort as opposed to someone else's, and the fact that people have such different varying levels of comfort in any situation. And it's a great game. It's called the traffic light game. It goes down a storm in our workshops, and when we're playing it, you see the students, the way the game works is that they indicate how comfortable or uncomfortable they'll be in a scenario we give them. And it's a really basic everyday kind of situation. You're on the bus on the way home, you're the only passenger, and then when the bus stops, one person gets on and they sit in the seat right next to you. That's our example we use. So, and then we'll say to them, and that is amazing.
I'm feeling awkward just at the idea of this.
For your listeners, they can't actually see what you're doing, I'm guessing, but you cross your arms. But that is part of our game. We use hand signals to show our levels of comfort, red, amber, and green. And they look around and they see their best friend sitting next to them with their arms crossed, saying, "Oh, that is just the most uncomfortable thing ever." Whilst they themselves are like, "That's not going to bother me at all." And their hands up are in the air and they're like, "I'm a green traffic light for that." And it just shows them that actually our levels of comfort are really different, and it's okay. There's no judgment in that. It's just who I am. I'm really uncomfortable with a complete stranger sitting next to me on a bus. I'm really comfortable with it, and that's okay. But I have the right to voice that, and my experience is valid and it matters. And in the same way, I've got a responsibility to pay attention if someone's voicing their discomfort with something with me. Again, it's not a judgment on me. It just means they feel really differently, and I've got to pay attention to it. So it's those kinds of things which help overcome if there was embarrassment. If there was a sense of, it's a subject which is actually quite a serious subject, but it can lend itself to embarrassment and discomfort, even amongst the students. When we start out, often they're completely silent and they're like, "Oh no, she's asking me questions and I've got to answer them." But you probably get that when you're teaching most subjects, right? If you're not comfortable and familiar with it, or you don't know an answer, you just get a bit awkward, and you're expected to know everything somehow, or you tell yourself you are, but you're not. Yeah.
I love that as like an everyday example, and starting like those conversations you said about like, what are we comfortable with, what are we not? Because I was wondering about how maybe your workshops differ when you're talking to like the lower schools, so say like year 7 or 8 students, compared to like the sixth form, where like especially like year 13, where you're like, well, you are like, some of you are 18, you're legally an adult. So how might those workshops kind of operate differently, or is it like, obviously the content's going to be different, but how do you sort of set those up between the different year groups?
Yeah, so the focus, the content itself, actually, we cover the same topics and subjects, and that includes going through legal definitions of sexual assault and rape and nudes and image sharing, whether they're 11-year-olds or whether they're 18-year-olds. But the approach just changes. We change a little bit of the language. We might change some of the examples we use. With the younger groups, it's talking about personal boundaries and that kind of thing. And the older groups, they tend to be far more interested in the nuances of the law, for example, and how it's applied, but also how it plays out if there is a scenario. So it's more about making it relatable to where the student is developmentally. And we've created a spiral curriculum effectively. Over the last few years, we found that some schools are inviting us back in year on year, often to see the same students as they travel through and reach maturity. And so what we will do when they were, let's say they were 12 when they first saw us, and we've gone through all of the basics, and then the following year we might go back and we'll just recap those, because we can't be expected to learn and remember everything from a 1-hour consent workshop a year ago, but we just go through all of the basics. And then we spend the vast majority of it looking at examples and scenarios which might be relevant to where they're at that age. So the sixth formers, for example, you're absolutely right. They're about to head off either to university or workplaces into the big wide adult world. So the things they might be more interested in might relate to university relationships, longer term relationships, the coercive controlling type of relationships. So we cover those kinds of aspects. The younger groups, the year eights, just from talking to teachers, the year eights tend to be far more alive to the image sharing and the nudes. It's starting to become really apparent that they're starting to do it a lot more, or they're very familiar with it. And so we focus a lot, we do a deep dive into what that means, leaving aside the law, we cover the law, but also just thinking about the consequences of it. Why do people do it? And what can be problematic about it? And so we'll factor in where they're at depending on their age and the stage in life.
Monica, if you were talking to some school leaders and they were kind of, I'm not sure if I need this in my school. We haven't had any issues that I know of in my school, therefore maybe we don't need it. Are there any, like, I think there's an obvious comeback to that, but then there's the kind of, is there anything I should be looking at as a school leader kind of across my school? Okay, that's a sign, that's a red flag that we now need to be getting someone in to come and talk about this, apart from the obvious.
The obvious being that we did, in the past we have had the odd school we've approached and they've said we've either got this covered or it's just not an issue at our school. I don't think I've had that response from any school leaders in the last 2-3 years, particularly post Everyone's Invited. I think we all know just by the sheer volume of testimonies on Everyone's Invited and the follow-up from that, just in terms of how seriously schools are taking this, they've come to appreciate that just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. In fact, quite the opposite. It means that we aren't doing something about it because it's definitely happening. We tend to find, and I'm probably not answering your question really here, but we tend to find after our workshops, we see a spike in disclosures, or the school might see a spike in disclosures. So what will happen is they'll sit through our workshop and they'll either say something to us in the context of the workshop, or afterwards they'll go and seek out the safeguarding lead and they'll say, okay, or someone will be upset because of something we've talked about or covered. And we see that as an absolute positive. That is a sign that whatever education we've put in place there, or whatever education the school has put in place there, has given that young person the confidence to reach out for help. And that's so important. We see that as an absolute positive sign. And if you needed evidence, that's evidence in and of itself that this is happening. Might not be happening in a school space, but that's not really the point about it. A lot of these behaviors happen outside at parties or in parks or on buses. But the reality is these are all young people within a school environment, and that's where they should feel safe and be able to talk about these things and get the help they need.
It's about kind of empowering the students with the language and the understanding upon the legal side, so they can say, this has happened to me and I wasn't sure if this was okay. I just know it made me feel uncomfortable, but now I know I can go and talk to someone. I've got the language to go and talk about. And sometimes those words, like I know delivering PSHE myself, sometimes not having the words makes it hard. As soon as someone teaches me word, it's much easier to talk about these things. We've talked a lot. We keep coming back to like the legal definition consent. I feel like we should actually define what consent is. As we've got you here, Monica, it would seem not to. So if a teacher's listening to this and goes, a student asked me tomorrow about like what is the actual definition of consent, what do they say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the first things we cover in our workshop, and we put the definition on the board and we break it down and talk it through. The legal definition of consent is when someone agrees to do something through choice. They have the freedom to make that choice and they have the capacity to make that choice. And those are the three elements: choice, freedom, and capacity. And we talk about them, we break them down, and then we apply them, we give them scenarios and we get them to talk about it. And if there's any confusion or misunderstanding, we come back to it and we say, let's just think about it. It's all about choice, freedom, and capacity. Those are the only things you need to assess whether consent was there. Was one of them missing? Well, then there was no consent there. Were they all there? That was a consensual example. So yeah, that's the legal definition.
And it's interesting in that definition, there's no mention of what is taking place. That, as you said, that can apply to anything. And I think that's what you're saying is with your workshops, like you you put that scenario for students that they can recognize, and then when they come to a situation that is maybe unfamiliar with them, they've kind of got that reflection upon a situation that they recognize, and then they've got the language to come back to it.
Yeah, I think what I really like about that as well is I sometimes feel teaching PSHE that it's so negative and like down on the kids, you know what I mean? Like, don't do this, don't do that, you know, you do this and this is going to happen to you. And you don't want to scare them into being like, you know, this is what life is like out there. But as you say, like, it is actually just about like safeguarding and protecting our young people and preparing them for any kind of scenario. We're not necessarily talking about something, as you say, in like a sexual relationship. Like, this can be, you know, any part of your life where actually you need some understanding of what these things are. We're not trying to scare you. It's just about us like preparing you for the world.
Yes, and you know, we're a really positive organization in that sense, because our approach to it is very much that we can empower, and they can therefore look after themselves and each other and look out for each other, because ultimately all we want is for people to have safe, healthy, but fulfilling relationships. We want our relationships to be happy ones that are good and healthy. And if we don't show them what that looks like, or give them examples of it and demonstrate it, how are they going to be able to even identify the bad ones, right? So it's a fine balance. We do want to arm them with that knowledge, and we try to take an approach which is not so much don't do X, Y, and Z, because sometimes that's super obvious when you state it. We will often say, if you do these things, if you do check, and you're always checking for enthusiastic consent, and you're looking out for these signs, these are the signs you already know and you already recognize it, you're not going to accidentally overstep someone's boundary, right? You're not going to make a mistake if you're always looking out for that. And so showing them that it's meant to be a positive, fulfilling experience, hopefully takes away from the negative of an adult standing there saying, don't do that, it's bad.
Yeah, I love that. Like the positive modeling of, yeah, it's to answer all of those. But what if questions, when you just, yeah, especially I think actually having a conversation with some year 10 students last week, they had in their PSHE lessons some scenarios, and it was, you know, is this enthusiastic consent being given? Is this we need to check again for consent, or is it no consent? And even having those, like, what's enthusiastic consent, miss? Like, what does that mean? And even just like going through that with them, once they had an understanding of, like, as you say, the sort of legal definition of consent, then actually the models of what does that look like I think was probably like the most useful part of that kind of session with them, which obviously you guys at the Schools Consent Project do as well.
Yeah.
It's like when I asked you if you wanted to step in for Mike tonight, you enthusiastically consented that you absolutely wanted to do this. Monica, just before we kind of round that, I have one question that we were chatting off pod and I would like an answer to. So like, you go into all types of schools, you go into mixed schools, girls' schools, boys' schools. And I was just wondering if there's any kind of taking into context the gender of the workshop facilitator, because we were having a conversation about sometimes students are like I don't want this conversation with a male teacher, or like vice versa. So I was wondering if that's something, if that's a factor, or if it even should be a factor.
I don't know the answer to the second half of that, whether it should be a factor. The answer probably is it shouldn't be, but the reality is that some students might be more comfortable with their facilitator being of the same gender or not. We, generally speaking, most schools don't say to us, we are a girls' school or a boys' school, or we're a co-ed school, but can we have split groups? Can we have a female facilitator for the girls, etc.? It has happened in the past, and we will always try and accommodate if we can. But the reality is that we find we go into all sorts of schools, right? So we'll go into girls' schools, we'll go into boys' schools, we'll go into co-ed schools. The co-ed schools are usually a good indicator of what happens when you bring those genders together, two sexes together into that room. And you can never predict what that's going to be like, because it's so individual to those students and to that particular cohort. We've delivered workshops to a year group, and we only do small group workshops, so it's like classroom sizes, 30 children at any one time. And so if we're delivering to year 10, we often will have to do 8 workshops, and we'll run them through the school day or whatever it is. And even in that 1 year group, no 2 workshops might be the same. Their attitudes might not be the same. So it's really hard to generalize whether the sex of the facilitator makes any difference, but it's certainly very hard to generalize what single sex spaces might be like or might not be like as well. We have fantastic feedback though from our schools, for our facilitators generally, but we had a male volunteer who went into a girls' school to deliver the workshop. And I make the point because the vast majority of our volunteers tend to be female. This conversation tends to just lend itself to that. But we've got some fantastic male volunteers. And the teacher messaged me partway through the workshop, and usually when I get a message like that, I'm like, oh no, what's happened? And all she messaged me was to say, I'm sitting in this workshop and Alex is fabulous. The girls are really taking it in. He's so empathetic and he's a great role model. You know, he's a great role model, and that works for boys too, because boys need good role models to look up to know what how to behave, what is being a man, what is being a boy. And so I always hesitate if anyone asks whether that makes a difference. Of course it makes a difference, but it's an individual difference rather than anything very generic.
But maybe like where you're coming at it, as you said, like it's lawyers delivering workshops and it's about the law and it's factual. So actually, do you know what I mean? You're coming at it from that perspective anyway.
Yeah.
I feel that's a lovely
Love
story
that.
to kind of round up our conversation, Monica. It's been absolutely like we could keep talking.
Yeah.
Like Amy sitting next to me, you could you could talk about this for hours. So it's so interesting hearing what you do. I know you've worked with like 30,000 students, which is absolutely awesome. You're off going to America, right? If I'm correct. So like,
Well, we've at last count, we've surpassed 40,000 students since we
Wow.
started, and we've launched in New York as of last September. That's obviously a completely separate laws and completely separate part of the organization, but it's been phenomenal. Yes, yeah. The need for this education is, as I said, it's global. It's not restricted to just these shores.
yeah, I was being a bit facetious earlier when I was saying someone maybe saying I don't get why I would need this, because I think as educators, as people go into schools, as people part of our society, I think we all recognize that this is something we need to be talking about, and we need therefore to be talking about with our young people because like they're part of society. Monica, it's been a massive, absolute pleasure. Someone's listened to this and gone, yep, I want to learn out more about the School Consent Project. What do they do? Where do they go?
Probably the easiest thing is to jump on our website, which is www.schoolsconsentproject.com, and you'll find more information on there and an inquiry button, so you can just pop an inquiry across to us.
And absolutely, please do go and look at that website, even if it's just to get some of the language on there, and you can just then use that in your classroom. Monica, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on TandTeaching. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
Listeners, we'll be back in a moment.
Hello, it's Bradley Bush here from Inner Drive. I'm a huge fan of the TNT podcast. I love listening to every episode. If you like all things cognitive science, please do be sure to check out our book, The Science of Learning, or better yet, follow us on Twitter at inner_drive. Now let's get back to the pod.
Welcome back to TandTeaching. Amy, what a pod for you to make your debut on.
Oh, so great. It's that topic, honestly, I could talk about for hours. So I think Monica has got off easy that we've only talked to her for half an hour. I could have chatted about that all night.
So if I was asked for your kind of main takeaway, or what do we call it, Amy's mini thoughts?
My mini thoughts.
Your mini thought. What's an Amy mini thought
My
based on that chat?
Post-it note summary thought. I think I would say I love what she was saying about how we don't have to have conversations about consent just about sex and like sexual relationships. Like we can actually start those conversations just with everyday scenarios about, you know, how comfortable are you in this, you know, everyday situation. Like she gave the example of just like being on the bus with, you know, with one other passenger. And I think, as we said, like so often these conversations can feel really quite heavy, especially when you get into talking about, you know, consent in relationships connected to the law. So I love that as actually there's so much more to the topic of consent and so many other ways to get our students to understand those sort of big ideas. What about you? What are you taking away?
I mean, there's so much to take away there.
much.
But for me, it was at the very end when Monica was talking, she said, what we're basically trying to do is help students look out for themselves and each other. I just think giving the students the language, the scenarios as you're talking about, where they can recognize things that aren't right, either to themselves, but also when they're with their friends and when they're out and about, not even with their friends. It's something important. And giving the students that language in order to then be able to communicate those kind of quite raw feelings.
Just like, do you mean just kind of recognizing those red flags?
Recognizing red flags, but also recognizing it is a red flag, because we all know stuff that's awkward for us, but it's quite empowering.
Or it's a red flag for me, even if my friend seems comfortable with it, but I'm still going to go and talk to someone because actually that conversation might be what protects my friend.
No, absolutely. And I think hopefully what you're hearing here, listeners, like this is just a lovely conversation starter for you to be having in your schools, whether you're part of the PSHE team or you have nothing to do with it. Please go and check out the School Consent Project website. It's a great way to go and talk to them and see how they can help you. Their workshops are absolutely brilliant, and they're great value, by the way. So like really do go and check them out. Amy, thank you for making your full debut on TandTeaching.
It has been a privilege.
Been a privilege. Mike, are you okay?
Mike's coming back next week.
Who knows? Who knows after
I'm
this
not
performance?
taking his job.
We will let the listeners decide. Listeners, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time on TandTeaching. Thank you for listening to this episode of TandTeaching.
If you've enjoyed the content of this episode, please feel free to share it with other educators.
And if you're able to, please leave a review on the platform.
And as always, thank you for listening to TandTeaching.